The first warning was not the snow, it was the horses. Just after noon, Clara Miller stepped out of the shed with a split basket of kindling hooked against her hip and found both mares pressed against the far fence, their rumps to the wind, their heads low. The older one, Bess, had worked through blizzards, river crossings, and one prairie fire without much complaint. Now she stood rigid enough to look carved from brown wood. A white crust already filmed her lashes. Clara set the basket down. The Bitterroot Valley was strangely quiet. No jay scolded from the cottonwoods. No magpie hopped along the fence rails looking for grain. Even the creek below the rise, usually loud where it shoved under the first ice of winter, seemed to have pulled its voice underground. She could smell metal in the air. Her father used to call that smell a bad promise. Clara turned toward the western ridge. Clouds had stacked above it in layers, dark at the bottom and pale at the top, like wet wool laid over dirty linen. The sky did not look like a storm that would drift in by evening. It looked heavy enough to fall. She carried the kindling into the cabin and fed 3 pieces into the iron stove. The door hinges squealed. A coffee pot sat near the edge of the heat, half full from breakfast. Beside it was a plate with 1 biscuit hardened to stone. The domestic smallness of those things steadied her. A cup, a spoon, flour dust on the table, her father's old wool coat hanging from a peg, life reduced to objects that did what they were supposed to do. Outside, the mare stamped. Clara took down the storm shutters. For 3 years, she had run the homestead alone. 3 years since Silas Miller had gone from coughing in the evenings to sitting up all night because lying down filled his lungs, and then from sitting up to not breathing at all. People in Hamilton had told her the place was too much for one woman. Sheriff Elias Thorne had used a kinder voice than most, which had made the advice worse. Sell before winter, he had said. Clara had thanked him and changed the subject. She knew every stubborn nail in the place, every board that swelled in spring, every fence post that leaned after rain. She knew where field mice entered beneath the pantry, and which roof shake lifted when the wind came from the northwest. Hard work did not frighten her. What frightened her were changes in familiar things. The valley had changed. 3 days earlier, there had been no reason to believe it would. Clara had spent the morning in Hamilton trading eggs for lamp oil and arguing over the price of salt. The town sat low beside the river, a row of false front buildings, hitch rails, sheds, and chimneys that smoked even on clear days. In winter, the mud froze into ruts so deep wagon wheels followed them whether a driver wished to or not. Martha Higgins had been behind the counter at the general store because her brother had gone east to collect a freight wagon. She slapped Clara's sack of salt onto the scale and frowned at the eggs. 2 are cracked. They were whole when I left home. Then your road cracked them. My road doesn't own chickens. Martha peered over her spectacles. You planning to argue until they heal? Yes. Martha gave her full value for the eggs. That was friendship between them. Insult first, generosity hidden inside it. Sheriff Thorne entered while Clara tied the salt sack. Snow clung to his boots. He was not a cruel man. Clara sometimes wished he were. Cruel men were simple. Elias Thorne was decent in ways that stopped exactly where risk began, and because he believed himself practical, he often mistook fear for wisdom. Clara, Sheriff, your north fence still down? Half repaired? Need hands? I have 2. Martha snorted. Thorne ignored her. There's a buyer asking about land up your way. Clara tightened the knot on the sack. My land? Land in general. Then he should buy some in general. He's offering fair prices. My answer is free. Thorne leaned an elbow on the counter. You had a hard harvest. Barn roof needs work. Winter looks early. All true. You could take enough money to start somewhere easier. Clara looked through the front window toward the mountains. My father spent 20 years making that place less difficult. Your father also had help. So do I. The sentence came out before she decided whether she meant Martha, neighbors, or someone else. Thorne followed her gaze. Many scars? Martha stopped arranging tins. Clara turned back. What about him? He's been seen near your ridge. He lives near my ridge, close enough to unsettle people. People in Hamilton are unsettled by weather, prices, strangers, familiar faces, and bread if it rises differently than expected. Martha coughed into her hand to hide a laugh. Thorne's expression hardened a little. I'm trying to look out for you. I know. Do you? Yes. That's why I'm answering politely. Clara lifted the salt and lamp oil. At the door, Thorne said, Silas trusted him more than I ever understood. Clara stopped. So did Silas, she said, and left. She saw Chaitton that afternoon at the north fence. He was on the far side of the pasture, replacing a rail, as if the argument in town had summoned him to prove its own point. His horse grazed among sage beyond the line. Chaitton worked with a leather loop around one wrist and a hatchet in his right hand, fitting the rail into a post notch. Clara reined in. "You know I can do that." He did not turn. "You were in town, so you waited until I was gone." "Yes, that makes it worse." He set the rail. "Fence is fixed. That doesn't improve your argument." Chaitton finally looked at her. He was older than when Silas first brought him injured into the cabin, though the years showed more in stillness than in his face. He wasted no motion. Even standing beside a fence, he appeared to be listening to country Clara could not hear. "Thorne says people are unsettled that you're near here," she said. "People are often unsettled." I told him that. He examined the post. Clara dismounted. "He also thinks I should sell." That got his attention. "Will you know?" "Then why tell me?" "Because everyone speaks to me as if my life is a problem requiring their solution, and I wanted one conversation in which the answer could simply be no." Chaitton nodded. "No, thank you." She checked the repaired rail. It was better seated than the one she had done herself. "I dislike how competent this is. You can make it worse if you want. I may." He picked up the hatchet. Clara noticed a brace of rabbits tied behind his saddle. "Hunting good?" Moving lower. "Because of cold? Because of something?" He looked toward the western ridge. "What?" Clara asked. "Deer left high ground early. Elk crossed south 2 nights ago. Storm, maybe." That was all he said. But she carried the unease home with her. The next day she checked hay twice, moved extra wood under cover, and repaired the barn latch. She told herself it was ordinary winter preparation. She did not admit she was acting on Chaitton's unfinished sentence. That evening Martha visited in a wagon with a sack of flour Clara had forgotten at the store. She also brought a pie with one side burned. "I refuse responsibility for this," Martha said, setting it on the table. "You baked it." Circumstantial evidence. They ate the unburned half while rain ticked against the windows. Rain in early winter bothered both women. It soaked the upper snow and added weight before a freeze. Martha glanced toward Silas's coat on the peg. "You ever think about leaving? Thorne sent you? He doesn't have enough sense to recruit me." "Then no." "No, you don't think about it," or "No, you won't leave." Clara pushed pie crust around her plate. "I think about it every hard morning." Martha waited. "Then I go feed the horses, and by the time I'm done I've decided again." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." "Good. I'd worry if stubbornness became easy for you." After Martha left, Clara stood on the porch listening to rain hiss into old snow. A shape moved at the timber edge. She knew before it stepped into moonlight. Chaitton. He did not approach the cabin. He only raised one hand, then pointed toward the barn roof, where Clara had left a loose length of rope hanging. Wind was beginning to lift it against the shingles. Clara sighed, fetched a ladder, and tied it down. When she looked again, he was gone. The watchfulness used to irritate her. After Silas died, Chaitton's presence at the edge of her life felt like proof that her father had not trusted her to survive alone. She resented venison appearing when game was scarce. She resented a fence repaired before she could reach it. She resented warnings about riders on southern trails. One winter she finally confronted him. "I am not a child. I know. My father is dead. I know. You can stop." Chaitton had looked at the wood he was splitting. "I will stop when what I promised is finished." What does finished mean? He had no answer that satisfied either of them. In time, Clara learned to separate the man from the promise. Chaitton never entered her house without invitation, never interfered with her decisions, never asked where she had been or who visited. His protection existed mostly in absence, a warning left on a fence post, tracks circling the pasture after strangers passed through, a repaired gate. Silas had asked him not to let her stand alone against the dark. Chaitton interpreted that literally enough to be infuriating and carefully enough to remain tolerable. On the morning before the avalanche, Clara found a bundle of dry cedar bark tucked beneath the porch bench. No note, she knew who left it. She used some to start the stove and saved the rest. Later, when the sky began to darken, that small bundle would be among the ordinary things that made her think not of being rescued, but of being remembered. She bolted the shutters across the south windows, then climbed onto the table and checked the stovepipe collar. The pipe had been cleaned the week before. She ran a finger around the fitting anyway. A low sound moved through the walls. Not wind, not yet. The logs seemed to hum. Clara climbed down slowly. On the shelf above the stove sat a small wooden box containing matches, 2 stubs of tallow candle, a sewing kit, and a folded paper she had not opened in years. The paper held one sentence in Silas's crooked hand. If the North Slope cracks after a wet autumn, don't trust the first snow. She had always assumed he meant a slide on the goat trail. That slope was 2 miles away and mostly rock. But autumn had been wet, and the first snow had come early. She pulled on her buckskin coat, wrapped a wool scarf around her head, and went back outside to bring the mares toward the barn. The temperature had dropped fast enough to make her nostrils sting. Fine crystals spun in the air, though no snow was falling yet. When she touched the gate latch, her glove stuck for a fraction of a second to the iron. "Come on, girls." Bess refused to turn her head. Clara crossed the yard, boots squeaking on new frost. She was halfway to the mare when a hawk came down out of the sky. It did not dive, it fell. One moment the bird was gliding above the timber. The next it struck the snow beyond the pasture with a muffled slap and lay still. Clara stopped. The first gust arrived from the ridge. It was so cold, she gasped. The air cut through the scarf and drew water instantly from her eyes. Bess screamed and kicked free of the shallow drift beside the fence. Clara gave up on the animals. She opened the barn door, shouted once more, then ran for the cabin. The western ridge vanished, not behind clouds, behind white. A wall of driven snow rolled through the upper timber, swallowing pine trunks as it came. Clara had seen blizzards erase distance, but this was different. The snow did not descend from the sky so much as advance across the land. She reached the porch and grabbed the frame. The ground shuddered. Something deep in the mountain made a sound like a tree breaking inside the earth. Then the world struck the house. The front window exploded inward despite the shutter. Clara turned her face as glass and splinters sprayed across the room. The door slammed behind her. The stove jumped sideways. Dishes flew from the shelf. The ceiling dropped an inch and sprang back with a crack that drove Clara to her knees. The noise became too large to hear as separate things. Timber, snow, rock, wind, glass, iron, everything arrived at once. She crawled toward the root cellar hatch. A second impact hit before she reached it. The room went black. Clara did not know how long she stayed face down on the floor. When she woke, the first thing she noticed was her cheek against something cold and sticky. Blood, she thought. She touched her face. Her fingers found only melted frost and a shallow cut near her temple. The second thing she noticed was silence. Her cabin had never been silent. Even on still nights, the stove ticked. Wind worried the eaves. Mice whispered in the wall. The creek made a low rush through the dark. Now there was nothing but the faint thud inside her own chest. She sat up carefully. "Bess?" The word barely existed in the room. It did not travel. Clara reached to her left and found the leg of the table. The table was tilted but upright. Her knees struck broken crockery. She moved slowly, feeling for familiar objects. Chair wall, stove, wood box. She found the matches. The first one broke. The second flared. For a heartbeat, the cabin appeared around her in a thin yellow circle. One shutter hung crooked. Frost whitened the inside of the wall. The rafters bowed lower than she remembered, and the stovepipe had shifted at the ceiling. Clara lit a candle. Its flame was small but steady. She went to the front door and put her palm against it. Cold pulsed through the wood. She lifted the latch and pulled. Nothing. She braced a boot against the floor and pulled harder. The door did not move enough to creak. Clara stared at it, then crossed to the broken front window. The shutter had failed, but no snow had entered. At first she did not understand why. Then she scraped frost from the glassless opening and touched what lay directly beyond the frame. Ice blew in the candlelight, not loose snow, not a drift. A solid mass packed against the house with no air between it and the wall. Her stomach tightened. She moved to the east window. The same. North wall, same. The avalanche had not buried part of the cabin. It had buried all of it. Clara climbed onto the table and struck the stovepipe with the handle of a spoon. The sound was wrong. A clear pipe should have rung. This one answered with a dull knock. She struck it again. Nothing above moved. The chimney was blocked. She looked toward the stove. The fire had been knocked down by the impact, but a red glow remained under ash. Instinct told her to feed it. Another instinct, colder and more useful, stopped her. No chimney meant smoke had nowhere to go. No chimney also meant fresh air had nowhere to come from. She opened the stove door only long enough to rake the coals apart, then shut it tight. Her father had once told her about 2 trappers who survived a cave-in only to die after they were dug out. No injuries. No blood. They had simply fallen asleep in bad air. Silas called it the quiet death. Clara sat at the table and watched the candle. The flame leaned once, then straightened. The cabin held perhaps one room's worth of air, plus the root cellar below. Cracks in the logs might leak enough to matter, unless the snow had packed against them like plaster. She did not know how deep she was. She did not know whether the barn still stood. She did not know if anyone had seen the slide. She did know the men in Hamilton would not cross open country until the wind settled. That thought brought another name with it, Chaitton. She pushed it away. Hope could make a person stupid as quickly as fear. She stood and began working. The root cellar was her first problem. The hatch had shifted in the impact and one hinge was bent. Clara pulled until it opened enough for her to squeeze through. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of potatoes, earth, apples, and damp boards. She lowered the candle. The cellar ceiling had held. Shelves leaned but had not collapsed. 3 jars lay broken. A sack of onions had spilled across the floor. Most important, the small vent pipe in the far wall was buried too. Clara held the flame near it. The candle did not lean, no draw. Still, the cellar gave her more trapped air. It also sat lower than the cabin, which meant heavier carbon dioxide would eventually collect there. She could not simply retreat underground and hope. She climbed back up. Her father had kept a carpenter's auger in the tool chest. Clara found it beneath a fallen chair and considered boring through the wall. The logs were nearly a foot thick, but she could manage that. The problem was what waited outside the wall. If the bit reached compressed snow, the hole might provide no air at all. Worse, if pressure found a weak point, it might drive snow into the room or split the timber. She set the auger aside. Every solution had become an argument with consequences she could not see. She took stock more carefully. 2 full water jars in the cellar, 1 partly frozen bucket upstairs, dried beans, flour, salt pork, dried apples, a small crock of honey, 6 candles if she counted the short pieces in the cellar, lamp oil nearly a quart, wood enough for a week if she were breathing ordinary air. The absurdity nearly made her laugh. She had supplies for a siege and perhaps air for a day, maybe 2. Clara carried 1 jar of water upstairs and left the rest below. She did not light the oil lamp. The candle was enough. Flame consumed what she needed most. She tested the house for leaks the way Silas had once taught her to test a barn in winter. She held a thread pulled from her scarf near the door seam. It hung straight, near the broken front window straight. At the corner where 2 logs joined, a faint tremble. Clara crouched there. She put her lips close to the seam. Cold. Not moving air exactly, but colder than the surrounding wood. She scraped away interior frost with the edge of a spoon and exposed a hairline crack. The avalanche had not sealed every part of the cabin perfectly. Somewhere inside the packed snow, a small pocket might connect to the surface, or at least hold trapped air. Clara did not enlarge the crack. She sat beside it. A ridiculous place to put hope, she thought. A crack no wider than a sewing needle. But hope, like air, did not need to look impressive to keep a body alive. She took a strip of cloth and tied it above the seam so any draft might move the loose end. Then she moved on. She wrapped the water jar in wool to slow freezing. She placed the food where it could be reached in darkness. She moved loose objects off shelves, so another shift in the roof would not turn them into falling weapons. The iron skillet went under the table. The poker went beside the stove. Matches stayed in her coat pocket instead of the box. Only after every practical thing had a place did she allow herself to think of the animals. Bess and the younger mare had been outside. The barn sat downhill from the cabin. Clara pressed both hands against the table and stared at nothing. She could not help them. That fact hurt because it demanded no decision. On a farm, nearly every problem asked for labor. A sick horse could be walked, cooled, wrapped, dosed. A broken fence could be mended. A dry well could be deepened. The burial had created problems beyond the reach of work. She hated it. Later, she said aloud. She had no idea whether there would be a later. The word still helped. The candle burned lower. Clara extinguished it. Darkness arrived so fast she flinched. She immediately wanted to relight it. Instead, she counted to 100. The blackness did not change. Her fear did. It rose, peaked, and became something she could carry. She found the rocking chair by touch and sat. Without the candle, sound became enormous. The swallow in her throat, fabric shifting at her elbow, the slow tick of the mantel clock which had somehow survived the slide though it ran unevenly now. Tick, pause, tick, long pause, tick. She let the broken rhythm keep time. After what she guessed was an hour, she lit the candle for less than a minute to inspect the roof and the cloth at the wall crack. The cloth had moved, perhaps from her own passage, perhaps not. She pinched the flame out again. That became her routine, darkness for long stretches, a brief flame for inspection, water in small mouthfuls. Food only when weakness made her hands shake. No fire, minimal movement. The discipline gave shape to confinement. At some point she realized the clock had stopped. The last hand rested between numbers. Clara lifted it from the mantel and held it against her ear. Nothing. She nearly threw it. Instead, she placed it face down on the table. If time refused to work, she would not look at it. First, she gathered blankets, coats, and the buffalo robe from the trunk. She placed one layer under the rocking chair and wrapped another around herself. She banked the stove completely. She found the water bucket tipped but not empty and poured what remained into the coffee pot, covered it, and set it in the coldest corner. She counted food. Half a loaf, 6 dried apples, a jar of beans, salt pork, flour. None of it mattered much if air ran out first. She moved the table against the door to brace it. The roof gave a soft, sick creak as weight shifted above. Clara froze. Dust sifted down. Then stillness returned. She sat. The candle made the room seem smaller. Hours passed without any visible sign that time existed. Clara measured it by the candle, by the stiffness entering her fingers, and by the heaviness growing behind her eyes. Twice she thought she heard something beyond the walls. Both times it was the house settling. She forced herself to breathe slowly, in through the nose, out through pursed lips. Silas had taught her the trick during a bout of panic when she was 13, and a flooded creek had trapped them on the wrong side of home. Air first, he had said, then thinking, then work. Clara tucked her feet inside his old coat. The wool still held a ghost of pipe smoke after 3 winters in storage. She closed her eyes. Somewhere above the buried valley, the day went on without her. Chaitton Many Scars saw the slide from the northern ridge. He had been checking a line of rabbit snares when the first concussion rolled across the basin. Snow lifted from the treetops as if the forest had exhaled. Then a white mass poured over the western slope and spread across the valley floor. He stood behind a fir trunk and watched until the movement stopped. The Miller cabin disappeared. So did the barn, the fence, and the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek bend. For a long moment, Chaitton did nothing. The wind tugged at his coat. His horse, tied lower among the trees, snorted and pulled against the reins. He knew the valley well enough to understand what he was looking at. A slide that large did not leave ordinary drifts. The lower layers would be compressed by their own weight, packed until a shovel met them like clay or ice. If the cabin roof had survived, the house might have become an air pocket. If the roof had failed, there was no one to save. He did not allow himself to decide which was true from the ridge. He descended. At the first open stretch, he stopped and studied the new surface. The old trail was gone. Wind was already smoothing what the avalanche had left. Chaitton turned to the western cliff, then to the notch in the northern ridge. He had walked between those landmarks dozens of times. Silas had once joked that Chaitton could find the cabin blindfolded if the chimney smelled of beans. Now there was no chimney. Chaitton measured with his stride. He did not hurry because haste in buried country killed people. A hidden tree well could break a leg. A hollow over the creek could collapse. He moved in a widening line until the slope beneath his boots matched his memory of the homestead yard. He planted a long pole into the snow. Powder for 4 feet, dense pack below. He pulled it out and moved 10 paces again. Again on the 7th probe, the pole stopped with a ringing vibration. Metal. Chaitton crouched. The chimney. His first feeling was not relief, it was fear. The top of the pipe was more than 15 feet beneath him. He took off his right glove, pressed 2 fingers to the cold pole, and closed his eyes. The metal held no useful warmth. Of course it did not. But it told him where the house was, and that was enough. He put the glove back on. "Hold," he said quietly, though Clara could not hear him. Then he began to dig. His spade had an ash handle and a broad iron blade polished bright along the edge. It was not meant for this work, but it was what he had. The upper snow came away easily enough. He cut a square shaft wider than his shoulders and threw each load downwind. At 3 feet the snow thickened. At 5 it hardened enough that he had to jump on the blade. At 6 his breath smoked around his face and froze into his scarf. By sunset the pit was above his waist. Chaitton climbed out, rubbed blood back into his hands, ate a strip of dried venison, and looked toward Hamilton. No riders. He had not expected them yet. The storm still owned the flats. He returned to the hole. The iron blade struck blue ice after dark. The impact rang through the shaft and up his arms. He struck again with less force, turning the spade to test the surface. Nothing. He chopped at the same place until a chip the size of a thumbnail broke free. The ice beneath the avalanche was not uniform. It had veins, some brittle, some dense, some layered with dirt and pine needles. Chaitton learned its grain by sound. A high note meant hard blue ice. A dull one meant compressed snow with trapped air. He worked along the dull bands when he could. The temperature dropped. The wooden handle began to creak. He warmed it between strokes with his breath and hands. After midnight, one hard blow made the blade shiver. Chaitton stopped. A hairline crack ran across the socket where iron met wood. He changed his grip and used shorter strokes. For another hour the tool held. Then the blade snapped. The sound was clean and bright. A piece of iron skittered across the floor of the shaft. Chaitton stared at the broken spade. Above him, stars had opened between torn clouds. The cold had sharpened them. Each one looked near enough to cut the skin. He climbed out and flexed his hands. He could stop. He could ride to town and return with men, picks, ropes, another shovel. By then, the remaining air in the cabin might be gone. He could also keep digging with a knife and perhaps die in the hole before reaching the roof. There was no good choice. That, too, was familiar. He sat on the rim of the shaft and remembered August heat. 6 years earlier, the creek had been low enough to show every round stone in its bed. Chaitton had been 20 yards from the water when his horse went down. The animal had stepped near a rattlesnake hidden beneath sage. It reared at the strike. Chaitton came off badly. His right leg trapped beneath the saddle as horse and rider hit the ground. He woke near dusk with fever in his body and the horse dead beside him. A white man stood over him holding a rifle. Chaitton reached for his knife. The man lowered the rifle first. "My name's Silas Miller," he said. "If I meant to shoot you, I wouldn't have introduced myself." Chaitton remembered hating him for the joke. Silas cut 2 cedar poles, made a drag, and hauled him to the homestead. It took hours. He did not ask where Chaitton had come from, what band he belonged to, whether soldiers were looking for him, or whether helping him would anger men in town. He splinted the leg and gave him his own bed. For 3 weeks, Chaitton stayed. The girl living in the cabin then was 17, all elbows and suspicion. Clara never stared at him, which he noticed because everyone else did. She left broth by the bed, replaced bandages, and argued with her father about wasting sugar in tea. When Chaitton could walk with a crutch, Silas took him outside in the evening. The air smelled of dust and bitterroot blossom. Silas pointed to the cabin window. Clara stood inside with a lamp, kneading dough at the table. "I'm not asking you to owe me," Silas said. Chaitton looked at him. "Then don't ask." Silas smiled without humor. "Fine. I'm asking you to remember." He coughed into his sleeve. "The town will help her when helping is easy. I've seen what happens when it isn't." Chaitton said nothing. Silas looked toward the window again. "If I'm gone and the dark comes hard, don't let her stand in it alone." It was too large a request for the way he said it. No ceremony, no witnesses, no bargain. Chaitton should have refused. Instead, he held out his hand. Silas gripped it, that was all. Years later, when Silas died, Chaitton did not come to the burial. Too many men from Hamilton stood around the grave, and Clara had enough to carry without the town watching her speak to him. But after that winter, he repaired a fence at night when a storm knocked it down. He left venison outside the shed during a lean month. He warned Clara about thieves moving up from the south. Sometimes she saw him, usually she did not. The promise became a quiet thing, until now. Chaitton rose from the edge of the shaft. He drew his hunting knife. The tip had broken years earlier against bone, leaving a short, thick blade. He tied the handle to his wrist with a leather thong so numb fingers could not lose it. Then he climbed back down. Inside the cabin, Clara woke with her head tipped against the rocking chair. For one wild second, she thought she had slept through an ordinary night. Then she smelled stale air. Her headache had deepened. A pulse beat behind both eyes. The candle flame had shortened to a blue-edged point. She had no idea how many hours had passed. Her mouth was dry. She drank one small swallow of water and stopped herself from taking another. The cold had become patient. It no longer shocked her when she touched the wall. It had moved into the room and settled there, filling the spaces between objects. Clara stood to stretch her legs. The effort made her dizzy. She sat again quickly, air first, thinking. Work, she repeated it silently. The trouble was that the first part was becoming harder. She listened, nothing. A peculiar fear began to grow in her. Not that she would die, but that no one would ever know exactly how long she had remained alive down here. Spring would come. Men would dig out the cabin and find her by the stove. They would say she died in the slide. They would be wrong by hours. Maybe days. The thought irritated her. That was useful. Anger was warmer than despair. She crawled to the hearth and found the iron poker. She climbed onto the table, raised it, and struck the stovepipe 3 times. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was painfully loud inside the room, and apparently meaningless beyond it. She waited. No answer. She struck again, then stopped to save strength. Near dawn, though neither of them knew it, Chaitton heard the pipe. He had been working in a crouch for so long that his knees would no longer straighten without pain. The knife chipped at the ice in small pieces. Every dozen strokes he cleared them with his forearm. His gloves had torn along the knuckles. He paused because a different vibration entered the wall. Metal on metal, 3 taps, then silence. Chaitton put his ear against the ice. Another faint clang reached him. His chest tightened, alive. He closed his eyes once, then resumed cutting. He no longer had to imagine Clara below him. She had answered. Chaitton stopped striking long enough to think. A person buried beneath him changed the excavation from a problem of depth into a problem of direction. If Clara could reach the stovepipe, she was probably still in the main room. The chimney line would give him a safer place to break through than the center of the roof, where the ridge beam carried most of the load. But sound traveled strangely through compressed snow. He needed to be certain he was following metal, not an echo. He struck the wall of the shaft twice with the butt of the broken spade handle. Then he waited. Inside the cabin, Clara heard the 2 dull impacts. For a moment she wondered if they meant anything. She lifted the poker and tapped twice against the pipe. Above, Chaitton heard the answer. He moved 1 pace east in the shaft and struck twice again. The return came fainter. He shifted west. 2 strikes. Clara answered. Louder. Chaitton's mouth tightened with something close to satisfaction. Not hope, information. Hope could wait. He marked the side of the shaft with the knife. Below, Clara understood the exchange. He was finding her. She rested. After a while, 3 impacts came down. Clara thought, then tapped 3 times. A pause. 1 impact. She answered once. It became a language without agreed meaning. Repetition itself meant enough. I hear you. I am here. Continue. Clara began rationing her strength around the signals. She did not strike constantly. Every noise cost motion, and every motion cost air. She waited until Chaitton paused or shifted position, then answered only what he sent. The discipline gave them cooperation across a wall neither could see through. At one point, the impact stopped for so long that Clara's fear surged again. She counted slowly to 100. Nothing. Another 100. She raised the poker and tapped once. No answer. Her grip tightened. She struck again. Still nothing. Above her, Chaitton had climbed out of the shaft because his right boot had split along the seam. Snow had packed inside and begun melting against his sock from body heat, then refreezing. Left alone, it would take the foot. He sat with the boot in his lap, trying to thread a leather repair through stiff holes using fingers that barely felt the cord. The work was maddeningly slow. Each time he dropped the thong, he had to search the snow by sight, because touch no longer helped. Then a faint clang traveled up the buried chimney. Clara. He looked toward the shaft. Another clang. I know, he muttered. His fingers could not tie the knot. Chaitton bent the leather around itself and used his teeth to pull it tight. He shoved moss into the split, wrapped the boot with the remainder of the thong, and stood. Before climbing down, he struck the exposed probe pole once. The sound traveled through metal. Inside, Clara heard a distant ring. Her shoulders dropped. She had not realized how tightly she was holding them. Fine, she whispered into the dark. Take your time. The absurdity of granting permission to a man digging through a mountain almost made her smile. When Chaitton returned to the bottom of the shaft, he altered his approach. Instead of cutting straight down, he angled toward the chimney and followed the denser line where snow had packed around the pipe. It was harder work but gave him orientation. Every few feet he tested with 2 strikes. Clara answered. Hours later, one of his blows produced a different vibration, not metal. Timber under load. He was close enough now that the cabin itself had entered the sound. Chaitton rested his forehead against the ice. 3 strikes. Clara answered with 3 faint taps. For the first time since the avalanche, neither of them was entirely alone. In Hamilton, men gathered around the stove in the general store and argued about whether anyone could still be alive at the Miller place. Sheriff Thorne stood with his gloves drying on a chair back. He had tried to lead 4 riders north at first light. They made less than 2 miles before the drifts forced the horses to their bellies. No roof could carry that slide, said the blacksmith. Thorne looked into his coffee. We don't know, the roof took it. Same difference. Martha Higgins, who had come for lamp oil and salt, stood by the door listening. Clara's alive until somebody sees her dead, she said. The blacksmith glanced away. Thorne sighed. Martha. Don't Martha me. We go back when the wind drops. And if it drops tomorrow? No one answered. Martha carried the lamp oil home without saying goodbye. At her kitchen table she set out 2 cups by habit, poured tea into both, and stared at the second until steam stopped rising. She left it there. By midday the storm strengthened again. She poured the cold tea outside. The dark liquid made a brief stain in the snow before the wind covered it. Far north of her house, Chaitton kept digging. His knife blade snapped at the tip near noon. He used what remained. When that became too short to pry, he wedged it into cracks and hammered the hilt with the heel of his hand. The cold changed his body in stages. First his fingers hurt. Then they burned. Then they stopped feeling much of anything. That frightened him more than pain. He climbed out, removed his boots, and stuffed dry moss around his toes. He drank snow melted in a small tin cup over a sheltered ember. The water tasted of ash. He chewed another strip of venison and nearly vomited because his stomach had tightened from cold and effort. He gave himself 5 minutes by the stars. Then he returned to the shaft. The hole was now deep enough that wind passed mostly above it. That should have made the work easier. Instead, the walls reflected his breathing back at him. The air smelled of iron, wet leather, and something old trapped in the ice. He began to hear voices. At first it was Silas. Not words. A cough behind him. Chaitton turned. No one. Later he heard his mother singing from a summer camp years gone. That sound was more dangerous. He stopped working and found his left hand resting flat on the ice as if he had decided to sleep against it. Chaitton jerked upright. His thoughts had softened. He slapped his own face. The pain was distant. He struck harder. Not yet. The words sounded thick. He began a low-endurance song, one he had used on long hunts when fatigue made distance seem impossible. He kept it quiet, not from shame, but to save breath. The rhythm organized him. Strike, pry, clear, breathe, strike, pry, clear. Breathe. By the second evening, the ice had begun to take his skin. A sharp ridge tore through the glove at his right knuckle. When he pulled away, the fabric stayed frozen to the wall for a second. He tore it loose and saw blood darken the leather. He wrapped the hand. Within an hour, the wrapping was cut through. He stopped looking. What mattered was sound. The blows had changed. Earlier they had returned flat and solid. Now beneath the impact, he heard a faint hollow note. Roof. Chaitton leaned his forehead against the blue wall and laughed once without humor. So close. The final feet were the hardest. Pressure had compressed the snow against the cabin into a dense, glassy layer. The broken knife scraped more than it cut. He tried his shoulder. The first blow sent pain through his collarbone. The second cracked a thin crust. The third opened a line long enough for the knife to enter. He worked the fracture. Inside, Clara heard the thud. She had been lying on the floor because standing made the room tilt. The candle was dead. Darkness had become complete enough that she could not tell whether her eyes were open without touching her eyelids. A vibration moved through the boards beneath her cheek. She held still. Thud. She pushed herself onto one elbow. Another. Not the house settling, too regular. Clara crawled to the stovepipe and lifted the poker. Her arm felt filled with sand. She tapped once, waited, tapped twice. For several seconds there was nothing. Then the ceiling answered. 3 hard blows. Clara bowed her head against the iron pipe. No tears came. Her body had no water to spend on them. She placed her palm against the pipe as if the person above could feel it. Chaitton, she whispered. The name scraped her throat. Above her he heard only a faint metallic tremor. It was enough. The knowledge that someone was above her changed the darkness. It did not make the air better. It did not warm the floor. It did not lighten the mountain pressing on the rafters. But it gave each next breath a destination. Clara shifted closer to the center support and listened for the pattern of Chaitton's work. Sometimes the blows came fast. Sometimes they stopped long enough that fear rose in her throat. She imagined him unconscious in the snow, or a collapse sealing the shaft above him. Then another scrape would come through the roof, faint but deliberate, and she would let her head sink back to the boards. She began to count between the sounds. Not seconds, tasks, 1 strike. Loosen the scarf around her neck. 2 strikes, rub her arms. 3, breathe once deeply and cough into the blanket instead of wasting strength sitting up. She found a jar of honey by touch and put the smallest amount on her tongue. Sweetness seemed almost obscene in the stale room, but it cleared her mind for a while. The quiet death did not arrive like an enemy breaking down a door. It came as comfort. Her shivering slowed. The floor no longer seemed unbearably cold. A warm heaviness spread through her chest and shoulders. She knew enough to fear it. Silas had described men found smiling in snowbanks, coats open, convinced summer had come for them. Clara tightened the buffalo robe around herself and repeated the names of ordinary objects: table, kettle, stove, chair, door, poker, father's coat. When those became difficult, she named people Martha, Elias, Silas, Chaitton. She heard her father answer, "About time you remembered me." Clara opened her eyes into blackness. The voice had come from the chair near the hearth. She knew it was not real. Knowing did not stop her heart from leaping. Silas sat there in her mind as plainly as if a lamp burned beside him. He wore the brown shirt with the missing cuff button. His beard was too long. One boot had the split near the toe that he always promised to mend and never did. "You look terrible," Clara whispered. "So do you." She almost laughed. The imaginary Silas leaned forward. "You hearing him?" A scrape came through the ceiling. "Yes, then don't make him dig for a corpse." Clara frowned. "That's a cruel thing to say. You always listened better when I was cruel." The chair was empty again. Clara touched the floor with both palms. The vision frightened her. Hallucinations meant her brain was losing ground. But the message remained useful. Do not make him dig for a corpse. She rolled onto her side and forced herself to sit. Above the roof, Chaitton reached the layer he had feared most. The ice directly against the cedar shakes was not brittle. It was wet-hard and dense, compressed into the contours of the roof itself. His shortened knife slid across it. He tried to wedge the blade between two layers and felt the steel bend. No, it snapped. The remaining piece jumped from his grip and vanished into the chipped ice by his knee. For the first time since he began, Chaitton stayed still for more than a few breaths. His hands rested on his thighs. Both gloves were ruined. Blood had dried, frozen, thawed against his skin from friction, and frozen again. His right shoulder had stiffened until lifting the arm made his vision spark. His legs trembled even while kneeling. Below him, Clara tapped once on the pipe. The sound was so faint he almost missed it. He looked at the ice. 6 inches, perhaps less. He could see a dark blur beneath it that had to be cedar. Chaitton removed his gloves. The air struck his skin like flame. His fingers were swollen and pale at the tips. 2 knuckles were split. A flap of skin had peeled from the base of his thumb. He placed both palms against the blue surface. Pain came first. The steam, not much. A small white breath where warmer blood met ice. He held his hands there. Human heat could not melt a mountain. He knew that, but he did not need a mountain. He needed a narrow weakness, a place where the surface softened enough for wood to show. He rubbed his palms over one small patch, then pressed them flat again. The pain climbed into his wrists. He pulled away only when the ice began to stick to skin. A wet shine appeared. Chaitton bent close and breathed onto it, again. He scraped with the jagged piece of steel left near the hilt. A thin sliver came free, wood. He saw the dark grain of a shook once. Not cold this time, relief. He put his ear to the exposed patch. "Clara," no answer. He struck the roof with his forearm. Inside, a shower of dust fell across Clara's face. She looked up. The ceiling was still black, but somewhere above the rafters a different sound had entered the house. Not ice wood. She crawled beneath it. "Here." Her voice failed. She coughed and tried again. "Here." Chaitton heard nothing with his ears, but the pipe gave 2 weak taps. He drove the steel into the seam between shakes. One cedar strip lifted. The mountain shifted. The shaft groaned around him. Chaitton stopped. A line opened along the wall of the pit and released a stream of fine crystals. The air pressure had changed. He could feel it against his cheeks, a faint draft moving where there had been none. He had reached the cabin's trapped air. That was good. It was also dangerous. He widened the seam a fraction. A high whistle burst from the roof. Stale, warmer air rushed upward, carrying smoke, damp wool, human breath, and the sweet, sore smell of a closed room. Fresh winter air plunged down in return. Inside the cabin, Clara jerked as the whistle screamed overhead. Wind, actual moving air. It cut her face and made her cough until her ribs hurt. She dragged in a breath, and the cold stabbed all the way to her lungs. It was the best pain she had ever felt. She laughed once and coughed again. The roof groaned. The new flow of air disturbed the packed snow around the opening. Loose ice slid into the shaft. Chaitton threw his shoulder against the wall and braced one boot higher. The tunnel narrowed. A slab the size of a saddle dropped behind him and blocked part of the exit path. He cursed under his breath. Fresh air had bought Clara time, but the breach had made the shaft unstable. He could not leave her below while he dug a safer entrance. He might not have strength to return, so he widened the hole. He broke the cedar shake with the heel of his hand. Splinters entered his palm. He did not feel some of them. A ragged opening appeared. Blue daylight filtered into the cabin. To Clara it looked like a star. She stared until her eyes watered. Then a hand came through. For 1 second she did not recognize it as a hand. It was swollen, blood-dark, and stripped across the knuckles. The fingers curled slowly. Searching the dark, Clara reached up. Her fingertips touched his wrist. Chaitton went still. The contact was weak, barely there, alive. He lowered his arm farther. Clara wrapped both hands around his forearm. The warmth of blood from his torn skin smeared across her fingers. Neither spoke. Speech had become unnecessary. Chaitton pulled his arm back and tore away another board. The hole was too small for Clara's shoulders. He used the side of his body to break the next shake. It cracked. The shaft dumped a load of ice down his back. He bowed beneath it, cleared what he could, then reached through again. "Can you stand?" he rasped. Clara heard only part of it. She nodded, realized he could not see, and forced out, "Yes." It was not true. She got to her knees. Then 1 foot. Then she sagged against the table. Chaitton widened the opening until he could push his shoulders through. "Close your eyes." "What?" Eyes shut. She obeyed. He dropped halfway into the cabin, hooked his forearms under her arms, and pulled. Pain tore across his hands where they rubbed against broken wood. Clara cried out as ribs struck the hole. "Again," he said. She pushed with her feet. He hauled. The tunnel took them a foot at a time. Chaitton climbed backward, bracing his boots in cuts he had made on the way down. He could not grip her properly. His hands no longer closed, so he trapped her against his chest with his forearms and lifted using his legs and back. At one point, his right knee buckled. They slid several inches. Clara's hip struck the ice. Chaitton slammed an elbow into the wall and stopped their fall. They stayed there, breathing hard. "Leave me," Clara whispered. He looked down at her. The dim blue light made her face nearly colorless. "No, you'll fall." No, that was all he gave her. He began again. The climb seemed longer than the dig. Clara kept her face against his coat. It smelled of frozen leather, sweat, cedar smoke, and blood. Under her cheek, his heart beat too quickly. Each time it stumbled, fear entered her more sharply than when she had been alone. She started helping with what strength she had, pressing a boot into the wall whenever she found a notch. Once she managed to lift enough of her own weight that Chaitton made a sound of surprise. "Again," he said. They developed a rhythm, his pull, her push. Rest breath, his pull, her push. The circle of sky widened. At the top, Chaitton turned, shoved Clara ahead of him, and lifted with everything left in his body. She spilled over the rim onto fresh powder. For several seconds, she could not breathe at all. The open air was too cold, too clean, too large. She pressed her face into the snow and coughed. Chaitton climbed out behind her and collapsed on one knee. "Don't open your eyes yet," he said. Clara laughed weakly. "You keep saying that because you keep trying." It was the first almost normal exchange they had shared in years. She covered her face with both hands. When she finally looked, the world hurt. The snow reflected the late morning sun with such force that every surface seemed edged in knives. Tears ran from her eyes and froze at the corners. She squinted through her fingers. Nothing she knew remained visible. The pasture was gone. The barn was gone. The fence posts were buried. The cottonwood stood only as a few black branches rising from a plain of white. The hole beside her looked impossible. A narrow blue shaft descended into the earth, its walls chopped and scraped. Red stains marked the last several feet, dark in some places, pink in others. Clara turned toward Chaitton. He sat with his head bowed. His bare hands rested on the snow. She saw the damage clearly for the first time. "Your hands." He looked at them as though she had named someone else's injury. "They work enough." "No, they don't. We move." "You can barely sit." "The wind is turning." Clara looked west. A gray veil trailed along the ridge. Another storm line. Chaitton tried to stand. His right hand gave way when he pushed against the snow. He fell back hard. Clara crawled to him. "Stop." His jaw tightened. "Listen to me." She put one hand against his chest. "If you die 10 feet from that hole, I will kill you myself." For a second he stared at her. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. It disappeared quickly. "We move," he repeated. This time they did it together. Chaitton had left a small cache near the upper edge of the slide before digging. Rope, a blanket, dried meat, and a folded rawhide drag used for hauling game. Reaching it took nearly an hour. Clara walked behind him, placing her boots in his tracks. The surface crust broke unpredictably. Twice she sank to her thigh and had to crawl out. Chaitton's pace was slow enough that she could follow, though she suspected he was slowing for her rather than because he wanted to. At the cache, he wrapped her in the blanket. She tried to wrap his hands. He pulled them away. Later, now. We need shelter. Then I bind them while you decide which direction shelter is. He looked at her. Clara had spent 3 days with no one to argue with. She found the act almost restorative. Chaitton sat. She tore a strip from the bottom of the blanket and wrapped the worst of his right palm. The cloth stuck almost immediately where blood had not frozen. She worked as gently as numb fingers allowed. Does it hurt? Yes. The honesty surprised her. Good. He raised an eyebrow. If it hurts, it's still alive. He nodded once. The wind carried a new sound. Bells. Horse tack. Chaitton turned his head before Clara heard it clearly. Riders appeared along the southern rise, 5 of them. Sheriff Thorne led. The search party came slowly, horses picking through the crust. They had waited for a break in the weather and approached from the lower ridge, expecting to mark the likely location of the homestead for spring recovery. Thorne saw the hole first. He raised a hand. The line stopped. No one spoke for several moments. The white plain was scarred by one vertical excavation, piles of chopped ice, broken metal, and blood. Clara stood wrapped in a torn blanket beside it. The sheriff's face changed. Clara? She did not answer. He dismounted. One of the men crossed himself. Thorne walked to the rim and looked down. His gloved hand picked up a broken piece of the spade. He turned it over. What did this? Chaitton sat against the rawhide drag, eyes half closed. The cold, Clara said. Thorne looked at Chaitton's hands, and after that, Clara's voice sharpened. He did. No one asked what she meant. The answer was visible in the shaft. Thorne removed his hat. I tried yesterday, he said quietly. Horses couldn't. Clara looked at him. He stopped. Explanations sounded small in that landscape. A rider named Boone stepped forward. We've got a spare horse. Chaitton opened his eyes. No horse through the lower crust. It will break. Boone frowned. You walked it, not the same. Even exhausted, Chaitton's knowledge of the snow controlled the moment. He pointed with his forearm toward a darker line near the timber. Ridge, then Higgins' line shack. Thorne nodded. We'll take you. Chaitton started fastening the rawhide drag with his forearms. The sheriff moved to help. Chaitton shook his head. Your men test the path. It was not pride. Clara understood that immediately. He was assigning the task most useful to them. Thorne understood a moment later. He sent 2 riders ahead on foot with poles. Clara sat on the drag only after Chaitton told her twice. She hated it. He had already spent himself reaching her, and now he tied the rope across his chest because his hands could not hold it. I can walk. You can fall. So can you. Yes, that is not an argument. It is enough. He leaned into the rope. The sled moved. The search party followed in a strange, subdued procession. The men had come prepared to recover bodies. They carried canvas, picks, and 2 long poles for locating a buried structure. None of those tools had been used. Clara watched their faces as they passed the excavation. Each man looked down. No one met Chaitton's eyes. At the timberline, Clara refused the sled and walked. Her legs shook, but she placed each boot in the prints he left ahead of her. The world smelled of frozen cedar and horse sweat. After the dead air of the cabin, every scent felt too strong. She could hear everything. The squeak of leather, the scrape of runners, a horse blowing ice from its nostrils, a branch clicking in the wind. Sound itself seemed miraculous. The Higgins line shack sat on a stone shelf above the creek, used in summer by ranch hands and in winter mostly left empty except for emergency wood. Martha had kept it stocked since Silas died. Smoke already rose from the chimney. Thorne's men had sent a rider ahead. Martha stood in the doorway when they arrived. She saw Clara first. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Then she crossed the snow and slapped Clara across the shoulder. You miserable girl. Clara stumbled into her arms. Martha held her for exactly 3 seconds before pushing her toward the door. Inside. Chaitton reached the threshold and stopped. The heat from the room rolled outward. His body began shaking so hard his teeth struck together. Martha pointed to a stool. Sit. He did. That frightened Clara more than if he had argued. The shack smelled of pine smoke, onions, wet wool, and coffee. A pot of broth trembled on the stove. The warmth made Clara's skin burn. Her feet itched violently inside her boots. Martha pulled off Clara's outer coat and wrapped her in 2 dry blankets. Slow, Chaitton said from the stool. Martha glanced at him. Warm her slow, he repeated. Hands and feet last. I know how to warm a half-frozen fool. He closed his eyes. Clara knelt in front of him. His hands were still wrapped in the torn blanket strip, stiff and crusted dark. Martha, water. Warm, not hot. Already coming. They worked without ceremony. The cloth had frozen into Chaitton's wounds. Clara soaked it a little at a time. When the first strip loosened, she peeled it back and went pale. Martha inhaled through her nose. The skin over several knuckles was gone. Cuts crossed the palms in intersecting lines. 2 fingertips were waxy white. Splinters of cedar remained embedded near the thumb. Chaitton watched Clara's face rather than his hands. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Watch me decide whether I'm strong enough to look. Are you?" She swallowed. "Yes, then look." She did. There was no useful place for pity. Cleaning had to be done. Bleeding had to be stopped. Frostbite had to be protected from sudden heat. Clara used a small pair of tweezers to remove the visible splinters. Chaitton did not move until she reached one buried deep near the base of his finger. His breath caught. "There," she said. "So you do feel it. Enough. Good. You said that before. I mean it again." Martha handed her clean linen. There was not enough. They used strips torn from an old undershirt, then from a flour sack. Even then, the bandages needed ties. Clara reached behind her head. Her braid hung heavy between her shoulder blades, tangled with frost and dirt. Martha saw the knife in her hand. "What are you doing? Hold this, Clara. Hold it." Martha took the braid. Clara sawed through it near the nape. The severed hair dropped into Martha's hand. For a second, Clara's head felt strangely light. Silas used to brush that braid when she was little, clumsy, and careful, swearing every time he caught a knot. The memory passed through her and was gone. She separated the hair into long strands, braided thin cords, and used them to secure linen over Chaitton's palms without tying pressure directly around the injuries. Chaitton opened his eyes. His gaze went to her shortened hair, then to the dark strands wound around his bandages. "You didn't need to. Neither did you." His expression changed. Clara continued tying. "That answer bothers you?" "Yes." "Good." Martha turned away, so neither of them saw her smile. By evening, the sheriff had returned to town with 3 men. Boone stayed to help at the shack. Chaitton drank broth from a cup Clara held because his fingers would not close around it. The first time she lifted it to his mouth, his eyes hardened. "What?" she asked. "I can do it." "With what?" He looked at the cup. Clara softened her voice. "You pulled me through 20 feet of ice. Let me manage 6 inches of tin." He drank. Later, after Martha and Boone slept, Clara woke to the smell of singed leather. Chaitton sat near the stove. He had worked something from his pocket using his elbows and bandaged hands. The thin leather thong that had tied the broken knife to his wrist. He held it over the fire for a moment. Then he dropped it into the flame. The leather curled. Smoke rose, sharp and bitter. Clara watched from her blanket. "Was that my father's promise?" Chaitton did not turn. "The last piece of it I carried. And now, paid." The word should have relieved her. Instead, it made the room feel unexpectedly empty. "So you're free of us." He looked at her then. "Of debt." Clara waited. He offered nothing more. Outside, wind pushed against the shutters. She looked at the burning thong until it became ash. The next morning, they took a wagon into Hamilton. No one cheered. Clara was grateful for that. The town had been talking since Thorne returned, but seeing the survivors quieted people in a way stories had not. The wagon wheels creaked through packed snow. Martha walked beside the team. Clara sat under blankets near the front. Chaitton sat behind her with both hands hidden under a buffalo robe. Men stepped from the general store. The blacksmith stopped swinging his hammer. A woman carrying flour stood in the street and forgot to move. Sheriff Thorne waited outside his office. His hat was in his hands. When the wagon drew level, he stepped forward. "Chaitton." Chaitton looked at him. Thorne seemed to have prepared a speech. It abandoned him. "I was wrong," he said. The admission drifted white in his breath. Chaitton nodded once. The wagon continued. Clara turned and looked at the sheriff until he lowered his eyes. She did not enjoy his shame. That surprised her. 3 days earlier she might have. Now shame seemed useless. A person either helped with the next piece of work or did not. At the doctor's house they learned what the mountain had taken. Clara had frost-nipped toes, a bruised rib, and lungs that hurt but cleared with rest. She would recover. Chaitton's hands were less certain. The doctor unwrapped the bandages slowly. "Some tissue will die," he said. Chaitton watched without expression. "Will I lose fingers? I don't know. Say what you do know. You'll keep most, maybe all. But movement." The doctor flexed his own hand. "Tendons are badly strained. Scarring will tighten. You may never close a full grip again." Clara stared at the floorboards. Chaitton said, "Can I hold a rein? With practice? A knife, perhaps differently. A bow? The doctor hesitated. Not as before. That was the first answer that landed visibly. Chaitton's jaw shifted. He had hunted with a bow since childhood. It was not only a tool, it was a language his body knew. Clara felt something inside her tighten. He noticed. Don't. She looked at him. Don't what? Make a grave out of my hands. I wasn't. You were starting. She wanted to deny it. Instead, she nodded. All right. The doctor began rewrapping the wounds. Clara watched carefully. If grief was not useful, learning might be. She asked how often the dressings should be changed. She asked which salve reduced cracking. She asked how much movement was safe. Chaitton gave her a sideways look. She ignored him. The winter did not release them quickly. For weeks they stayed at Martha Higgins's house because the Miller homestead remained buried, and Chaitton's small camp near the ridge had been destroyed by wind. Martha's home settled into a new rhythm. Bread before sunrise, water heated in the black kettle, bandages changed after breakfast. Clara practiced walking until her toes stopped burning. Chaitton practiced opening his hands. At first the movement was almost invisible. He placed palms on his knees and tried to straighten the fingers. The right index finger moved first, then the thumb. These others followed in degrees. He did not count progress by what hurt. He counted by what worked. Clara understood that instinct because she was doing the same with breathing. For the first week she woke choking whenever the room was too quiet. She would sit upright, convinced the chimney had sealed again, and listen for wind against the shutters. Once Chaitton found her standing barefoot beside the stove at 2 a.m. with the poker in her hand. He did not ask what was wrong. He opened the front door. Cold air moved into the room. Clara stood in it until her lungs accepted that air could come and go freely. Then he shut the door. Thank you, she said. Chaitton went back to his chair. He had refused Martha's guest bed. He slept near the entrance, boots on, as if some part of him expected another wall of snow to arrive before dawn. They did not speak about that either. Words had become strange between them. Too much had happened without them, so they spoke about work. How many cords of wood did Silas leave under the shed? 3 if the slide didn't scatter them. Fence posts? Enough for the south line. Seed? In the root cellar if it stayed dry. What roof pitch? You know the roof pitch. I want to hear if you know it. Clara threw a rolled sock at him. He caught it awkwardly against his chest. For a moment both stared at the sock. Then Clara laughed. Chaitton's smile appeared slowly, as if the muscles had forgotten the motion. It changed his face more than she expected. Martha looked in from the kitchen, saw them, and backed out without comment. Late February brought a week of softer weather. Men from town began visiting more often than necessary. Some brought flour, cured meat, or split wood. Some came to look at Chaitton's hands and tried not to make it obvious. The blacksmith arrived with a pair of modified leather grips stitched around wooden handles. For tools, he said, setting them on the table. So you don't need to close the fingers all the way. Chaitton examined them. The blacksmith cleared his throat. I can change the angle. Chaitton slid one over his palm and flexed. No, this is good. The blacksmith looked relieved. Clara saw then that shame could become useful if someone gave it a task. Sheriff Thorne came last. He brought the broken pieces of the iron spade wrapped in burlap. I thought you might want these. Chaitton did not reach for them. Martha took the bundle. Thorne stood awkwardly by the door. There's talk of a collection, he said, for repairs when the thaw comes. Clara looked at Chaitton. He looked at her. It's your house, he said. The old answer rose in Clara immediately. I don't need charity. She swallowed it. Pride had nearly no value under 20 feet of snow. What kind of collection, she asked. Lumber, nails, labor, not money. Then yes. Thorne nodded. At the door he paused. Clara, she waited. I truly thought no one could live through it. So did I. He looked surprised. That doesn't mean you were wrong to turn back, she continued. It means next time you don't decide alone when another person's hope is finished. Thorne absorbed that. Then he left. Chaitton watched the door close. Next time? Clara glared at him. There will not be a next time. Good. Was that humor? No. It was close. By March, the snow in town sagged away from buildings. Roofs dripped at noon. The road became alternating ice and mud. Clara's hair, hacked short at the back, had begun to grow unevenly. Martha threatened twice to trim it properly. Clara refused. It reminds me I did something useful with it. It reminds me you cut it with a paring knife. Also useful. Chaitton listened from the doorway, rubbing oil into the scars across his palms. His hands had healed enough to uncover for several hours a day. The skin was pink, silver, and red, drawn tight over the knuckles. The fingers curled naturally inward now and resisted full extension. He could hold a cup with both hands. He could buckle a strap using thumb inside of finger. He could not yet draw a bow. One afternoon, Clara found him behind the house trying. He had strung a light practice bow borrowed from a boy down the road. His left hand held the grip, using the blacksmith's leather brace. His right fingers hooked the string. He pulled. Half draw. The scar tissue across the palm tightened. The string slipped free. The arrow dropped into the snow. Chaitton stood motionless. Clara remained by the corner of the house. She knew he had seen her shadow. He picked up the arrow. "Telling me not to make a grave of your hands," she said, "was easier when they were wrapped." He looked at her. "I did not say it was easy. What do you need?" "Time." "Anything else?" he considered. "A different release." Clara nodded. The next day she asked the blacksmith to help design one. Chaitton complained. Then he used it. It did not restore what he had lost. It gave him another way. That became the shape of their recovery. Not restoration, adaptation. There were setbacks that did not fit neatly into either word. One afternoon in March, Martha asked Clara to fetch preserved peaches from the pantry. The pantry was hardly larger than a closet, built into the cool north side of the house. Clara stepped inside, reached for the jar, and heard the door swing shut behind her. The latch caught. Darkness. No wind, no moving air. Her body returned to the buried cabin before her mind understood where she was. The jar slipped from her fingers and shattered. Clara hit the door with both palms. "Martha!" Her voice came high and thin. She yanked the latch. It would not move. The pantry walls seemed to press inward. The smell of sugar syrup thickened into stale cabin air. She could hear the impossible silence beneath 20 feet of snow. Her lungs stopped working properly. Clara kicked the door. "Open it!" Footsteps crossed the kitchen. The door did not open immediately. Instead, Chaitton's voice came through the wood. "Clara, open it!" The latch is bent. "One moment." "Open it now." "Listen, something scraped outside." "What are you doing?" "Taking the hinges." She heard metal against metal. Chaitton could not close his fingers well enough to work a screwdriver in the usual way. So he had begun carrying a short-handled tool wrapped with leather. The scrape repeated. Clara pressed her forehead to the door. "Talk." He was silent for half a second. "About what?" "Anything." Another scrape. "The mare bit Boone yesterday." Clara's breath caught, then came out almost as a laugh. "Why?" "He tried to curry her while holding an apple." "That was stupid." "Yes." "Did he blame the horse?" "Yes." "Then he deserved it." A screw dropped. Chaitton swore softly. Clara focused on that ordinary sound. "Your turn," he said. "What?" "Anything." She closed her eyes. Martha hid sugar behind the tea tins. From the kitchen, Martha shouted, "I can hear you." Clara laughed for real. The hinge came loose. Light opened in a thin line at the side of the door. Chaitton pulled it away from the frame. Clara stepped into the kitchen and kept moving until she reached the outside porch. Cold March air filled her lungs. She bent forward with hands on her knees. Chaitton stood several feet away. He did not touch her. Martha appeared at the doorway with a broom. "I'll have that latch fixed." "No." Clara straightened. "Leave it off." Martha started to object. "Please." The older woman nodded. That evening, Clara cleaned the broken peach jar herself. The next day, she went into the pantry again. The door remained open. She stayed long enough to count all the jars. A week later, she asked Chaitton to put the latch back. He studied her. "Why? Because I want a pantry, not a shrine to something that happened." He repaired it. Afterward, he showed her how the pin could be lifted from inside with a nail. Clara kept the nail on the shelf. Chaitton's setback came more quietly. The modified bow worked for light practice. But one cold morning, his right hand cramped around the release and would not open. The arrow flew wild into a fence post. The sudden recoil split scar tissue across his palm. He dropped the bow. Clara was in the barn and heard the string. By the time she reached him, Chaitton had wrapped the hand in his shirt hem. "Let me see." "No." "That has stopped being a convincing answer." "It is not bad." "Then showing me will prove you right." He stared at the fence. Clara waited. At last he held out the hand. The split was shallow but long. Blood welled along the pale ridge of scar. She cleaned it by the pump. Chaitton did not look at her. "You miss it," Clara said. "What?" "Not hunting, the way you used to do it." His face closed. Clara tied the cloth. "You can tell me to mind my business." "Mind your business." "All right." She gathered the basin. "Clara," she stopped. Chaitton looked down at the bandaged palm. "I knew where my hands were without looking." She set the basin back down. "When?" "Before." He opened the fingers as far as they would go. Bow, knife, reins. "Stone." "I did not think." Now every object asks a question first. Clara understood more than he expected. In the cabin, I knew every step from the bed to the stove in the dark, she said. After the slide, the same room became unfamiliar. I kept reaching where things used to be. He looked at her. Every object asked a question, she continued. Door, does it open? Stove, can I burn it? Candle. Can I afford the air? I hated the questions. Chaitton's shoulders lowered slightly. What did you do? He asked. Answered them one at a time. He glanced at the bow lying in snow. Bad answer. Then asked a different question. The next week he stopped trying to reproduce his old draw. He shortened the bow, adjusted the release, and changed his stance. His accuracy was poor for days. Then it improved. He never became the same archer. He became an archer again. That distinction mattered. The town changed by degrees too. At first, people approached Chaitton as if he were a relic brought down from the mountain. They stared at his hands. They asked questions about the excavation that no answer could satisfy. How long did you dig? Did you really use your bare hands? Were you afraid? He disliked all three. Clara began intercepting visitors. If you came to bring wood, stack it. If you came to bring food, kitchen. If you came to make him repeat the worst 2 days of his life so you can tell the story at supper, go home. Martha approved so strongly she began using the same rule at her own door. Eventually, curiosity became contribution. Boone brought a roll of good leather for tool grips. A rancher who had once refused to sell Chaitton a saddle cinch left 2 new ones without a note. The schoolteacher asked if he would show older students how to read winter tracks and accepted his refusal without offense. Most unexpectedly, Sheriff Thorne began stopping by, not to apologize, but to work. He split wood. He hauled water. He helped the blacksmith reshape a handle. He did these things badly enough at first that Chaitton finally corrected him. Your axe is turning. Thorne wiped sweat from his brow. It's an axe. It still turns. How? Your shoulder. Thorne tried again. The log split cleanly. He stared at it. Chaitton walked away. Clara watched from the porch. That was the closest thing to forgiveness either man seemed likely to offer. In late March, the town held a supper to collect building supplies for farms damaged by the storm. The Miller place was not the only loss, only the most dramatic. 3 barns had collapsed. A family south of the river had lost half its cattle. The road bridge needed new decking. Martha insisted Clara attend. Chaitton refused. You don't have to sit there while they stare, Clara told him. That is why I am not going. I know. She put on her coat. At the door she hesitated. I also don't want them telling your story as if you died. He looked up. People become very convenient when turned into stories, she said. They can mean anything. Then correct them. All night? Yes. Clara narrowed her eyes. He almost smiled. She went alone. The meeting hall smelled of stew, wet coats, lamp smoke, and sawdust. Long tables filled the room. Near the front, someone had placed 1 broken shard of Chaitton spade beside a collection box. Clara stopped. Martha followed her gaze. I told them not to. Who did? The blacksmith thought it would remind people. Of what? Clara crossed the room and picked up the shard. Conversation softened around her. The blacksmith approached. I didn't mean disrespect. I know. She wrapped the iron in the cloth beneath it. He isn't a symbol, she said. The blacksmith flushed. He's home with cracked hands because cold makes them hurt. If you want to honor what he did, bring cedar tomorrow and stop asking him how much blood there was. Silence. Then Boone stood from a bench. I've got cedar. Another man said I can bring nails. A woman near the stove offered quilts. The room moved on. Clara took the spade piece back to Martha's house. Chaitton was awake by the fire. She put the wrapped iron on the table. They displayed you. He opened the cloth. This is the spade, part of it. Then they displayed the spade. You know what I mean? Chaitton turned the iron in his hand using both palms. It broke. Yes, I did not barely. He set the shard down. Maybe that is why they need it. Clara sat across from him. You don't mind? I mind people watching my hands while I eat. That seems reasonable. The iron does not care if they stare. Clara considered that. The next day she returned the shard to the blacksmith with one condition. No speeches. He agreed. The spade pieces ended up with Martha anyway. She claimed she was protecting them from rust and from men who liked speeches. No one argued. By the time the first hard thaw began, Clara could enter a dark room without losing her breath. Chaitton could close his left hand around a mug and his right around a modified rein. Neither achievement was complete. Neither needed to be. They had stopped asking when they would be what they were before. April arrived loudly. The valley thawed as if it resented the work. Every afternoon ice cracked somewhere in the foothills with the flat report of rifle fire. Water ran brown beneath the snow. Roads disappeared under mud. The Bitterroot River lifted against its banks and carried branches, fence rails, and once an entire chicken coop passed Hamilton in a spinning procession. Clara stood on Martha's porch one morning and smelled wet earth for the first time since the avalanche. The scent stopped her. It was so ordinary that it hurt. Pine, mud, horse manure, wood smoke. Rotting leaves uncovered after months beneath snow. Life smelled untidy. She loved it. Chaitton came around the side of the house carrying 2 saddles awkwardly, one hooked over each forearm rather than held by the grips. "Today?" Clara asked. He looked toward the northern ridge. "Ground is open enough." Martha came through the door behind Clara with a tin cup in each hand. "You two are not sleeping up there." Clara took the coffee. "We haven't even left yet." "You were thinking it." "I was not." Chaitton accepted the second cup. Martha pointed at him. "And you're worse. You don't say what you're thinking, which leaves everyone else to assume it's foolish." He sipped. "Today we look," he said. "Tomorrow? We work." Martha closed her eyes. Clara hid a smile behind her cup. They rode north after sunrise. The route bore little resemblance to the winter path. Snow remained in shaded gullies, but the open ground had turned black and soft. Their horses sank fetlock deep in places. Meltwater crossed the trail in a dozen new channels. Clara rode behind Chaitton. She had expected fear when the ridge came into view. Instead, she felt numb. The land was too changed to match the picture in her memory. The avalanche had stripped bark from trees. Rocks lay where pasture had been. Whole drifts had collapsed into pits that exposed branches and debris trapped inside. At the last rise, she stopped her horse. The Miller cabin sat below, still standing. Not whole, but standing. Clara put a hand over her mouth. The roof ridge had bowed. Several shakes were missing where Chaitton broke through. The porch leaned to one side. The barn was gone except for 2 upright posts and a wall half buried in mud. The fence had become scattered lumber, yet the chimney remained, crooked, blackened, and stubbornly vertical. Chaitton waited without looking back. He knew better than to speak into that moment. Clara dismounted. Her boots sank into mud. She walked down the slope. The front door stood open. Sunlight entered the room in a broad gold strip. Clara stopped on the threshold. During the burial, she had imagined light reaching the floor more times than she could count. Now the real thing seemed almost indecently bright. The cabin smelled of damp cedar, old ash, mold, and silt. The table had tipped onto one side after she left. A chair lay broken near the wall. The stovepipe hung crooked but intact. Her final candle sat melted into a puddle of tallow on the shelf. She crossed to the spot where she had lain listening to Chaitton dig. The floorboards looked harmless. Clara touched them with the toe of her boot. A memory flashed through her body before her mind could name it. Thick air, no light, cheek against cold wood. She stepped back. Chaitton entered behind her. He did not touch her. "Open the other door," she said. The cabin had only one proper door, but the root cellar hatch stood near the stove. Chaitton understood. He lifted it. Clara opened the remaining shutter, then another. Air moved across the room from 3 directions. She stood in the middle of it until the panic eased. "Better?" he asked. "Yes." He glanced up at the roof. "Ridge beam must be replaced." Clara followed his gaze. "Can it?" "Yes." "With your hands?" "With everyone's." That answer made her look at him. 6 months earlier, Chaitton would have chosen to do the work alone rather than owe the town anything. The mountain had changed more than his fingers. They spent the day making lists. Roof beam. 12 cedar shakes, 3 floorboards, 1 shutter. New door brace, barn roof if the foundation was still sound. Well cleaning, chimney reset. Fence later. Inside the root cellar, they found most of Clara's seed jars dry and intact. Potatoes had rotted, but beans, corn, squash seed, and 2 packets of herbs survived in sealed tins. Clara held the seeds against her chest. "Worth coming back for?" Chaitton asked. She looked around the damaged cellar. "Yes." He nodded. They rode to Hamilton before dark. The next morning, a wagon arrived at the Miller place before they did. The blacksmith drove it. Sheriff Thorne sat beside him. Behind them came Boone, 2 ranch hands, Martha's oldest son, and a carpenter named Ellis, who charged too much for everyone except widows, whom he charged nothing and insulted while working. Clara stopped her horse at the sight. Thorne climbed down from the wagon. "You said labor, not money. I remember. Then don't argue. I wasn't going to." He studied her suspiciously. "You look like you were. I'm improving." Chaitton rode past them toward the house. Boone muttered, "That means we start." They did. The rebuilding changed the social order of the valley in small ways no speech could have achieved. Men who once avoided standing too near Chaitton now took instruction from him because he knew which lower logs had shifted under pressure and which could be trusted. Chaitton could not swing a heavy hammer for long, but he could see a structure. He directed leverage, load, and sequence with precision. "Lift there," he told Boone. "Why there?" "Because if you lift the center first, the wall bows." Boone looked at Ellis. The carpenter nodded. They lifted where Chaitton said. By noon, the wall was square. Clara worked with Martha clearing mud, washing salvageable dishes, and boiling linens. Every so often she looked through the open doorway and saw Chaitton standing among the men with his scarred hands tucked under his arms, explaining with a tilt of his head or a movement of his shoulder what needed doing. No one called him savage. No one called him hero either. That was better. Hero was another word that could keep a person outside the circle of ordinary life. At sunset, they ate stew from tin bowls on the porch. Martha sat with her back against a post. Ellis complained about the nails. The blacksmith complained about Ellis. Boone fell asleep sitting upright. Clara listened to them and realized the cabin was making noise again. Not the frightening kind. Human noise. Bowls scraping, boots shifting, someone clearing his throat. Martha scolding a grown man for dripping stew on her blanket. The sound filled spaces the snow had emptied. Chaitton sat on the bottom step away from the group. Clara carried him a cup of coffee. He took it with both hands. His grip was clumsy but secure. "Look at you," she said. "What? Showing off." He glanced at the cup. Very dangerous skill. She sat beside him. Their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. The town crew returned for 5 days. On the 6th morning, only Chaitton and Clara rode out. The cabin had a new roof beam, straight and pale, against older dark cedar. The chimney drew properly. The door opened without sticking. Ellis had repaired the porch but deliberately left one old gouge near the threshold. "House ought to remember something," he said when Clara asked why. She kept the mark. The first night she slept there again. Clara left every shutter open. Chaitton had planned to return to his repaired camp near the northern timber. He stood on the porch after supper with his bedroll under one arm. Clara saw it. "You're leaving." "My camp is dry enough. The roof leaks. Only one side. That is the definition of leaking." He adjusted the bedroll. Clara looked past him at the darkening yard. She had known this moment would come. The debt was paid. The repair work could be shared. No practical reason remained for him to live at her threshold. "Stay tonight," she said. Chaitton's expression became careful. "Why?" Clara almost lied. "Because it is late. Because the ground is wet. Because Martha will blame me if you freeze after surviving 50 below." Instead, she said, "Because when the house gets quiet, I still hear the snow." He looked at her for a long time. Then he set the bedroll down by the door. "Tonight?" Clara nodded. She slept badly anyway. At midnight she woke convinced the air had thickened. Her eyes snapped open. Moonlight crossed the floor. The shutters were open. Wind moved the curtain. Chaitton sat awake in the chair by the door. "You don't have to guard it," Clara said. "I know. Then why are you awake?" "My hands." Pain, she understood. She got out of bed, heated a little water, and brought the jar of pine salve. Chaitton placed his palms upward on his knees. The scars had cracked after the day's work. Clara spread salve across them with 2 fingers. His hands were different now. Thick ridges crossed the skin. The right middle finger no longer straightened. The left thumb had a pale, numb patch where frostbite went deepest. She worked without pity. When she finished, she did not pull her hand away. Her palm rested lightly over his. Chaitton looked down at the contact. "The debt is gone," he said. "I know. You don't owe me. I know that too." He lifted his eyes. Then why? Clara thought of the buried cabin, of his arm descending through blue light, of the first fresh air. But she did not want their future to be built only from catastrophe. So she answered with the present, "Because your roof leaks." For a beat he stared. Then he laughed. It was quiet and rough and real. Clara smiled. "That's not all," she said. "I know. But it's enough for tonight." He nodded. In the morning his bedroll remained by the door. By the end of the week it had moved to a peg. Neither mentioned when that happened. They began planting as soon as the ground stopped clinging to their boots. Clara dug rows for beans and squash. Chaitton set cedar stakes using the blacksmith's grip around a wooden mallet. The first time he struck a stake, the vibration traveled through his scarred hand and made him stop. Clara looked up from the row. "Too much?" He rotated his wrist. "No." "Different?" "Yes." He struck again, changing the angle. The stake entered the soil. Work became a series of such adjustments. Chaitton looped reins around his palm rather than closing his fingers. He sharpened knives with a clamp. He used a lighter bow with a leather release designed by the blacksmith. Some days the scars swelled and he could do less. On those days, Clara did not tell him to rest. She changed the task. Seed corn needs sorting. Roof tar needs heating. Tell me which posts are straight enough. At first he resented how easily she redirected him. Then he began doing the same to her. When she climbed the barn frame despite a lingering dizzy spell, he said, "Come down. I'm fine." "Then come down while fine. I can finish this. You can also sort seed." Clara looked at him from the ladder. He raised one scarred eyebrow. She climbed down. They learned each other through work, because work was safer than confession. Clara learned Chaitton hated overcooked beans, preferred coffee strong enough to float a nail, and could repair a saddle beautifully despite damaged fingers if given enough time. He slept lightly. He hummed when concentrating but denied doing it. He kept every useful piece of leather longer than any sane person would. Chaitton learned Clara talked to animals when angry, read the same page 3 times when worried, and kneaded bread too hard if someone from town had annoyed her. She hid good jam behind flour so visitors would not finish it. She left doors open in every room, even during cold nights, until Chaitton cut small vents into the shutters, so moving air could be felt without losing all the heat. Neither said thank you for those accommodations anymore. Gratitude had become embedded in routine. The broken spade stayed at Martha's house. She refused to return it. "Bad luck," Clara told her. "History," Martha said. "It's scrap iron. Then you won't miss it." Martha kept the 3 pieces wrapped in oilcloth in a chest near the kitchen. Summer deepened. Wild clover came up thick where the avalanche had scraped the ground raw. The barn frame rose. The creek cleared. Meadowlarks returned to the fence line as if nothing extraordinary had happened. One morning, Clara carried 2 mugs of coffee to the garden. Chaitton was setting the final stake beside a row of beans. Sunlight caught the scars on his hands, turning them silver at the edges. She stood on the porch and watched him. He sensed her before she spoke. "The birds are back," she said. A meadowlark perched on the rebuilt fence. Chaitton rested the mallet on his shoulder. "They know before we do." "Know what?" "When the ground is ready." Clara walked down the steps and handed him coffee. He took the mug with one hand this time, not easily, but he took it. They sat on the porch. The silence between them had changed. Clara noticed this often now. Silence used to mean the buried cabin. No wind, no air, no answer. With Chaitton beside her, it contained small sounds, his breath, a bird, the river, the click of his thumbnail against the mug. She placed her hand over his right one. His fingers curled beneath hers, not fully but enough. "Silas would have hated that fence," she said. Chaitton looked toward it. Why? Too straight. He distrusted anything that made him look careless by comparison. Chaitton's mouth twitched. He built the cabin square, only because Martha mocked the first corner. They sat with that memory. Then Clara said, "He would have liked this garden." Chaitton's hand tightened slightly under hers. The promise to Silas was over. They both knew it. What remained could not be explained as duty. That made it more frightening in some ways. It also made it theirs. A week later, Chaitton rode to the ridge alone. The snow was gone except in high shadows. Mountain flowers grew where the excavation shaft had been. Meltwater had filled and erased the hole. No red remained in the soil. He stood at the approximate place where he had first driven the spade into the avalanche. There was nothing to mark it. He preferred that. Land did not need monuments for every wound. He flexed his right hand. The fingers stopped before closing completely. Pain tugged along the palm. He could no longer draw his old hunting bow. He could not grip an axe through a full day without swelling. Cold weather would hurt him from now on. Loss was loss. He had no use for pretending otherwise. But below him smoke rose from the Miller chimney, straight into a blue morning. He watched it for a long time. The sight no longer represented a debt. It represented breakfast burning because Clara forgot the pan when reading. It represented wet boots by the door and cedar shavings on the floor. It represented arguments over fence lines and 2 cups left drying beside the basin. Home, he had learned, was not always the place a person began. Sometimes it was the place that kept making room after obligation ended. Chaitton turned his horse downhill. Clara was on the porch when he returned. "You missed breakfast. I can smell that." She looked offended. "Nothing burned." "Then why is there smoke?" "Because stoves make smoke." "Not that much." She opened the door wider. "Come inside before I change my mind." He dismounted. At the porch he paused. Clara's hand rested on the cedar post beside her. He put his scarred hand over it, not because he owed her father, not because a mountain had forced them into the same story, because he wanted to. Clara looked at their hands together. Then she stepped aside and let him in. The first snow of the next winter came softly. That almost made it worse. Clara woke before dawn to a pale room and the whisper of flakes against the window. For several breaths she did not move. Her body knew snow before her eyes fully opened. The old fear arrived as a pressure in her chest. Then she heard the new roof vent ticking in the wind. Tick, pause, tick. Air moved through the small opening Chaitton had cut high in the wall and covered with a sliding wooden plate. The sound was deliberate, mechanical, ordinary. Clara sat up. Across the room, Chaitton was already awake. He slept in the bed they had built on the far side of the cabin now, no longer in the chair by the door. The decision had happened in late summer without a ceremony anyone could name. His boot stood beneath the bed. His coat hung beside hers. He looked toward the window. 2 inches, he said. You measured? I looked. That seems less reliable. 2 inches. Clara got out of bed and opened the stove. Warm coals glowed beneath ash. She fed cedar bark into them, the same kind Chaitton had left under her porch before the avalanche. Flame caught. Coffee followed. Then bacon in the iron skillet, a small luxury saved for the first snow, because Martha had decided traditions were more useful when they involved food. Neither Clara nor Chaitton spoke about the previous winter. They did not need to. Preparation had been their conversation for months. The new ridge beam was thicker than Silas's original. The roof pitch had been changed to shed snow faster. The chimney rose higher and carried an iron cap designed by the blacksmith to resist packing. 2 emergency vents opened from inside. A narrow hatch in the root cellar connected to a covered air pipe that ran beneath the porch and emerged downhill behind a timber shield. Chaitton had insisted on building a second exit through the rear wall. Clara had insisted it be large enough for Martha. Martha had insisted they were both insulting her. Now the rear door stood shut behind a clear path Chaitton had already shoveled before sunrise. Clara poured coffee, his hands wrapped around the mug more easily than they had in spring. Though the right middle finger still curved inward, cold made the scar lines whiten. Hurting? She asked. Yes. Bad? No. She accepted the answers. Outside, the meadow and fence disappeared beneath clean white. For a while, Clara watched through the glass. Snow was not the enemy. It took months for her to believe that. Snow could be weather, cover for seed, tracks in the morning, work for a shovel. A mountain of it could still kill. But fear did not become wisdom simply by growing large. After breakfast, she pulled on her coat. Where? Chaitton asked. Barn. Why? To look at the roof. We looked yesterday. Today there is snow on it. He stood. You are not coming. I did not say I was. You stood up. I also need wood. They went outside together. The snow came to Clara's ankles. She walked across the yard, leaving fresh prints beside Chaitton's. For a moment, the sight of white closing over the land brought back the buried plain and the dark wound of the excavation shaft. Then Bess's replacement mare pushed her nose over the fence and snorted snow into Clara's sleeve. Clara swore. Chaitton laughed. The fear broke. That winter had storms. None matched the avalanche winter. One dropped 3 feet in 2 days and kept them indoors except for the barn path. Another glazed the valley in ice. The north wind screamed at the eaves for 30 hours straight. Each time Clara listened to the vents. Each time they remained open. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she still woke and pressed her hand near the moving air. Sometimes Chaitton woke too and said nothing. By spring the act had become less urgent. By the second spring she occasionally forgot. Years did not erase the mountain from their bodies. Cold continued to stiffen Chaitton's hands. Clara disliked closed rooms for the rest of her life. A hard crack from a roof beam could silence her mid-sentence. Chaitton never again trusted iron tools in extreme cold without warming and testing them first. But those were facts, not masters. The Miller homestead grew around them. The rebuilt barn acquired a lean-to. The garden doubled. Clara planted apple trees, knowing she might wait years for decent fruit. Chaitton built a workbench with clamps and leather loops, placed exactly where his altered grip needed them. The first one looked strange to visitors. By the 3rd year, 2 older ranchers with injured hands had copied it. Sheriff Thorne resigned before he became an old man and took to raising horses south of town. He and Chaitton never became friends in the way Martha understood friendship. They became men who could work the same fence line without carrying old suspicion into every silence. That was enough. Martha grew older loudly. Her grandchildren spent summers at her house and learned quickly that the bundle wrapped in oilcloth beneath the kitchen chest was not to be touched without permission. Naturally, they wanted nothing more than to touch it. One hot afternoon, when thunderheads gathered over the western ridge and the air smelled of clover, Martha finally opened the bundle. 3 pieces of iron lay inside. The children looked disappointed. "That's it?" asked the oldest boy. Martha gave him a stare that had frightened better men. "What were you expecting, Gold? A sword. It was a spade. Why keep a broken spade?" Martha lifted the largest piece. Rust had roughened the fracture line. One edge still carried a dull polish where Chaitton had once driven it into frozen snow. "Because it broke," she said. The children waited. Martha enjoyed making people wait. "The winter you were all too small to remember. Snow came off the Bitterroot and buried the Miller place." "Your mothers told you that part?" They nodded. "And they told you Clara lived?" More nods. "What they probably did not tell you is everybody sensible decided she couldn't." The youngest girl frowned. "But she did. Yes, then they were wrong. Yes." Children accepted this more easily than adults. Martha placed the iron on the porch boards. Chaitton dug down after her. "Use this first." She touched the fracture. The cold broke it. "What did he use then?" Martha looked toward the northern ridge, whatever he had left. The children leaned closer. She did not tell them every detail. She did not describe skin frozen to ice or the smell of blood in the Higgins line shack. Some truths could wait until a person had lived long enough to understand cost without enjoying horror. She told them about the marks in the shaft, about Clara walking behind Chaitton in his footprints, about the town standing silent when the wagon came through, about dark hair braided into bandages because clean cloth ran out. The oldest boy touched the iron. Was he the strongest man? Martha considered. No. The boy looked confused. There's always somebody stronger, bigger, faster, better with a hammer. Then how did he do it? He kept choosing the next piece of work. The children were quiet. A meadowlark called from the fence. Martha wrapped the spade again. That evening, Clara and Chaitton rode over for supper. The children looked at Chaitton differently, which he noticed immediately. He sat at Martha's table and ate beans while 4 pairs of eyes kept drifting toward his hands. Finally, he set down his spoon. "What did she tell you?" Martha drank coffee with exaggerated innocence. The youngest girl blurted, "That the shovel broke and you didn't." Chaitton looked at Martha. "That is not exactly true." Martha shrugged. "Close enough for children." The girl frowned. "Did you break?" Chaitton held out his right hand. The scars were pale now, ridged and permanent. His fingers still would not straighten fully. "Yes," he said. The children stared. Clara watched from across the table. "And then?" the girl asked. Chaitton picked up his spoon again with the altered grip he had practiced for years. "Then I learned this." The child seemed satisfied. Clara looked down so no one saw the expression that crossed her face. Later, riding home beneath a clear sky, she said, "You ruined Martha's ending. She made it wrong. She made it dramatic. Same thing." Clara laughed. Their horses walked side by side along the river road. Fireflies flicked near the wet grass. The Bitterroot Ridge was dark against the last light. When they reached the rise above the cabin, Chaitton stopped. Below them the house glowed through open windows. The chimney released a thin line of evening smoke. The barn roof was straight. The garden rows formed dark bands beside the fence. Nothing about the view announced what had happened there. Clara was glad. A home should not have to remain a monument to its worst day. Chaitton flexed his hand on the rein. "Cold tonight," he said. "Not very." "Enough? Your hands?" He nodded. "There's salve by the stove." "I know." They rode down. At the porch, Clara dismounted first and opened the front door. She did not check the vent. Not that night. She carried in the coffee tin Martha had sent with them. Chaitton brought the saddle blankets. Their boots crossed the same boards that had once groaned beneath impossible weight. The house answered with familiar sounds. A kettle settling on iron, a chair leg scraping, a cupboard door closing, wind moving through a high vent. Chaitton sat at the table and placed his hands palms up while Clara warmed pine salve between her fingers. She worked it into the scar tissue, slow and firm. He no longer resisted her help. She no longer treated the hands as a debt recorded against her life. They were simply his hands, scarred, limited, capable. When she finished, Chaitton turned one palm and caught her fingers before she could move away. The grip was incomplete. It was enough. Before banking the stove, Clara checked the cedar box they kept beneath the rear bench. It held matches sealed in waxed paper, A coil of rope, 2 candles, dried meat, a small hatchet, and an iron awl. Chaitton had added a narrow-bladed shovel with a short wooden handle. He warmed the metal near the stove before storing it whenever severe cold was coming. Clara used to think preparation meant believing disaster would return. Now she understood the difference. Fear waited for the mountain to move. Preparation built another door. Vent? Chaitton asked. Open. Rear path? Clear this afternoon. Water? 2 jars. He nodded. They had gone through the same list on every hard-weather night for years. At first, it had been solemn, then routine. Now Clara sometimes found it almost comforting, like checking a harness before a ride. She looked toward the high wall vent. A narrow ribbon tied beside it stirred in the incoming air. Long ago, beneath the avalanche, she had used a scrap of cloth near a crack in the logs to tell whether the cabin still breathed. This ribbon was cleaner, brighter, and entirely unnecessary most nights. She kept it anyway, not as a memorial, as proof of movement. Outside, the mountains disappeared into darkness. Inside, air moved freely through the house.